Well, councillors, elected members of the Gunnedah Shire Council, my fellow councillors, the executive team and those listening to this live stream, or those who may just be getting the audio, welcome. I'd like to declare the April ordinary meeting of council opened at 4:30 p.m. I'd like to begin by just reading out a little detail of a circular from New South Wales Office of Local Government that was dated on the 25th of March, and it talks about the compliance with social distancing requirements to limit the spread of COVID-19 virus at council and committee meetings. The most important part in this circular, and there are two parts to it, I'll just read out. First one is amendments have been made to the Local Government Act 1993, allowing councils to meet remotely to assist them to manage the risk of transmission of COVID-19 virus at their meetings and to ensure compliance to the public health orders. The amendments take effect immediately from the 25th of March. Second point is the amendments will operate for a period of 6 months and may be extended for 12 months by regulation if required. So councillors, that is why we are here today in this extraordinary position of making history for the first ever council meeting of the Gunnedah Shire Council being held online and remotely. So it is very trying times. The coronavirus has affected our community in many different ways, and this is simply one way that this organisation is adapting to make sure, to the best of our ability, we can have business as usual and still make those very important decisions on behalf of those who have elected us to represent them in the Shire of Gunnedah. So as I said, councillors, today we make history. So we'll move on to the first item on our agenda, which is acknowledgement of country. And I would like to acknowledge the Kamilaroi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. I would like to also pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal community members who may be listening in to our ordinary April meeting of council. The next item on our agenda, councillors, is prayer. Now, normal convention is we would stand for prayer, that not being appropriate because of the fact that we are working remotely and online. So what I will ask you to do as I read the prayer, councillors, is simply to bow your head in respect as I read the prayer. So councillors, if you could please bow your head. Eternal God, our loving Father, we come to thee this day in the name of Jesus Christ, who is the lover of our souls and the saviour of all mankind. May we feel his love and respond to it. May his spirit shine in lives that are darkened by worry, doubt or fear. Strengthen and guide those who are trying to do what is right. Make it plain to them. Make us more mindful of the needs of our fellow men and less absorbed in the selfish concerns, that Christ may approve and bless what we do here this day. We ask these blessings in his name. Amen. Never more appropriate prayer. Councillors, will now move on to the third item on our agenda, which is bereavements. Now, the bereavements are between the 19th of March and the 15th of April. Councillors, we mourn the loss of Donald Richard Reid, Milton Thomas Muggleton, Michael James Fordham, Robert Allen James Bussink, Thelma McAdam, Leslie George Wrench, John Thomas Dickey, Shirley Margaret Stenholm, Damien Frederick Billsborough, Raymond Douglas Thomas, and Hilda Mary Bowden. Councillors and executive team members, could you please bow your heads with me for 1 minute silence as we pay our respects to the deceased and extend our condolences to the families and friends of those deceased. Thank you, councillors and executive team members. We'll now move on to the fourth item on our agenda, which is those present, and call for any apologies. We have had one request for leave of absence from Councillor Swain. I see all fellow elected members, 8 of us are here and present. So now, by show of hand, councillors, I'd like to call for a mover. That was moved by Councillor Hook and seconded by Councillor Fuller. I'll now put that motion. All in favour by show of hands. I call that unanimously supported and carried. Thank you. We'll now move on to item number 5 on our agenda, which is confirmation of previous minutes. First one is item 5.1, which is in relation to the ordinary meeting held, March ordinary meeting that was held on the 18th of March. And I'll call for a mover that they be true and correct. Thank you, Councillor Hook, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Hook, as a mover, do you wish to speak at all to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll now call for any councillors who may wish to ask a question or have a query. Councillor Moses is the seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak to him?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
That being the case, I'll put the motion. All in favour by show of hands. Call that unanimously supported and carried. Thank you. Moving right along to item 5.2, which is the extraordinary meeting of March held on Tuesday, the 24th of March. I'll now call for a move. Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Campbell, as a mover, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll now call for an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Fuller, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
That be the case, I'll put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? Well, they're unanimously supported and carried as well. Councillors, I'll now call for item number 6, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations in relation to any items on our ordinary April meeting of council? Please declare them now. And the executive team? Okay, no declarations of interest. We'll move forward. Item 7 is community presentations. There are no presentations in relation to the April ordinary meeting. So we'll now move on to item 8, which is a Mayoral minute. Now, councillors, it's quite extensive Mayoral minute that you've had an opportunity to read in your business papers. I just want to highlight a few of the items there. You'll see the motion is in 6 parts. The most important part really is in items 1, 2 and 3, I believe. So firstly, that first item in the motion is the Gunnedah Shire Council calls on the federal government and New South Wales government to urgently deliver comprehensive and multifaceted financial support and stimulus package to local government to enable to continue to operate effectively and provide essential services during the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. The second part is that council calls for the packages to include the following measures. Now, importantly, and this is consistent with the message that we and many in local government have had for some time, and that is an increase on the financial assistance grants from the Commonwealth Government to a level of 1% of Commonwealth revenue. Second part, to provide stimulus funding to councils for projects that will help sustain councils' operations and boost our local economies. And the third one, to increase access to TAFE, VET and other apprenticeship opportunities that council staff can undertake to address skill shortages. The third item there, council, is that council commends, and this is important also, the New South Wales and the Commonwealth governments on their stewardship during the crisis, and commits to work in partnership to protect community health and sustain local economies through this, or through our local economy through the remainder of this crisis. They are the key points. There are 6 parts to the motion. There are more details there, councillors, but simply because of time, I won't read out the entire motions, but this really falls in line with the position of our peak body, advocacy body, in LG New South Wales, who have approached all councils, I believe, in New South Wales, asking for them to support motions similar to this. So that certainly has us falling in line with our peak body in local government, New South Wales local government. So councillors, I move that Mayoral minute, and I'd now call for a seconder to that Mayoral minute, if I could please. Thank you, Councillor Luke. So councillors, I believe I've spoke adequately to that motion. So I'll now call for any councillors who'd like to speak against the motion or ask any questions. Councillor Luke, is a seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So councillors, if there are no questions, no comments, then I'd like to, Councillor Fuller, are you voting or would you like to speak to the motion? You're on mute, Councillor Fuller. Councillor Fuller, you're still on mute.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I totally support what you've got there. Totally in support of it. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. So councillors, in saying that now, I'd like to put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? I'll call that unanimously supported. Thank you. Now moving on, item 9, there are no items on the agenda for the General Manager's report, so we'll move straight to number 10, which is the Acting Director of Corporate and Community Services reports. And I'll call on Mr. Muldoon, and I'll ask Mr. Muldoon if he could please turn his video so we can see Mr. Muldoon. And I'll ask Mr. Muldoon if we could start, please, by speaking to item 10.1, the recommendation that's before in relation to item 10.1, as I said, 2017 to 2021 delivery program and 2020 to 21 operational.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is some confusion through the system this end. I'm not too sure whether anybody else is hearing that.
Yeah, no, I am, but it might be better if I just get rid of my head, go off video and just talk.
Is that okay now, Councillor Hasler? Is that okay? Will you still get feedback?
I'm still getting feedback.
Okay, Mr. Muldoon, can I ask that you please turn your video off?
Yeah, no worries, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I'm about to go now. So can I ask you please to talk through to your recommendation?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Mayor. The delivery program and the operational plan for 2021 is presented to Council in accordance with the Local Government Act. We're obligated to approve the plan before the end of June this year. And at the moment, the recommendation is to put that plan out on display for at least 28 days. In relation to the plan, the enactment of the business continuity plan and development of the implementation of the COVID-19 response strategy and associated business plans, it's resulted in our operations adapting to the changing environment. Major focus, as you'll deal with later in the meeting, is in the delivery program and the operational plan. There's mitigation and to minimise the impact on council staff, council's operations and the community. So council services and facilities have adjusted in line with both state and federal government requirements as the world experiences the impacts of COVID-19. Now, these responses and the preparation of any assistance packages have also been undertaken in efforts to minimise any adverse impacts on both the budget and the delivery program and operational plan. So before we move any further, I'd like to take the opportunity, if I may, Mr. Mayor, to pass to the Chief Financial Officer so Damien can provide some details in relation to that financial information. Is that okay with you?
Thank you. Mr. Connor, I might ask that you try your video.
They're coming through okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to the council. Councillors, I'll just add a little bit further around the budget in particular, just to try and amplify a little bit further the operational plan and the particular financial details contained therein. The first item that I'll point out is the overall result before capital grants and contributions being a consolidated surplus of about just over $800,000 for the financial year. First thing to note, when we break those down by fund, we're actually proposing a deficit in general fund of about $140,000 and surpluses in both water and sewer to make up the consolidated $800,000. Another item to note is the general fund also contains at the moment a reduction dividend of $670,000. So what that is that's a target for the organisation to try and achieve further reduction in cost or increase in revenue, or a combination of both. I'd suggest it's probably more likely the reduction in cost, considering the forward environment, in order to improve those results. So that dividend is put there because the exact areas and items where we'll get those benefits are yet to be determined, and we're trying to put some intelligence behind that rather than just to put a top-down reduction onto certain services. But for full transparency, the deficit in general fund would be a shade over $800,000 if we were not to get any of that reduction in dividend. And the overall consolidated result would be a modest surplus of $143,000. But certainly the direction of the organisation is to achieve those efficiencies or those reductions and post the results as headline presented. Excuse me. There's also some items to note around the revenue policy for this year. Councillors may or may not be aware that this was a revaluation year, happens for once every 4 years. And accordingly, every property in the Shire has had a revaluation done by the Valuer General in the last 12 months. As a result of that, the macro amounts of our values for properties and the different categories have changed reasonably significantly. Of note, farmland has increased by over 6%. Mining has increased its land value by about 60%. And the other two categories have either held steady or decreased their overall land value. Why this is of note, this adds some challenge to trying to hold steady the overall take from those categories until such time as a comprehensive review of our rating mix or a strategic rating mix can be done. So what we've modelled is our best endeavours to try and hold steady those different categories. So what we've come up with is an approach where the business category will actually be held at a zero increase across this year. The residential category, even though falling quite a bit in land value, will be held at the peg of 2.6%. And obviously, then that has to be shandied out across the other two categories, albeit considering the size and complexity of those. It's probably been a little bit more beneficial in order to do that, particularly with farmland making up over 72% of our total land value now for the overall Shire. But what we've put in place is what we believe is the most equitable and consistent approach for now, but noting that over the next 12 months there'll need to be a review done and some further rigour added to that split. And if there is a desire to change some of those macro allocations between the categories, then it's recommended that happen over the preceding 3 years of this 4-year window of reval, rather than putting shocks onto any individuals or any individual category. And that's what's modelled at this point in time in the draft. And the last thing to say, and I think everyone's pretty aware of, is that obviously our budget for the next year is going to face some further challenges. We're learning more all the time about the impacts of those and the extent of those impacts. You'd be aware that the federal and state governments have both put off passing budgets at this point in time. They're slightly different situation to us in that once they pass budgets, they often give a trigger to people to incur significant costs and gear their business towards delivering of those, whereas we're not quite in the same boat. So we don't have that downside. The upside that we do have is the ability to put in place where we are now and foreshadow really clearly to both yourselves and our community about where we sit to start with. But it also gives us a strong base to start modelling potential policies or strategies you may want to put in place as we move forward in different programs. and without us talking about what might happen on the top of a shifting sand result, we've at least got something that we can say as a base we're at, and then we can start to model those different impacts off the top of that result moving forward. Apologies for the long intro to all of that, but obviously they're extraordinary times, and we haven't had our usual time to go through some of this as we might do. But I will commend obviously the budget and the work that's gone into it from the whole organisation. I might leave it there, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connor. We may have, if we could, we might have Mr. Muldoon back on the screen. And councillors, you've now heard the recommendation before you, so I'll call for a move of the recommendation to become a motion.
I'm happy to move the motion as recommended that we put the document out for public exhibition. I think as Mr. Connor alluded to, it's a somewhat optimistic budget given the present climate and events that we're experiencing, but I think it's something which we can live with in the short term, if not longer term, and we do have 28 days for people to make comment if they do see issues.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. Before I ask you to speak to a motion going forward in the council meeting, I'll first get a seconder to the motion before I invite you to speak. So Councillor Fuller has seconded the motion. Councillor Hasler, I'll take that you've spoken to the motion. So I'll now call for a councillor who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. No, Councillor Fuller is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak? You're on mute.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if there's no further questions or comments, councillors, I will put this motion by a show of hands. Those all in favour? I'll call that unanimously supported and passed. Thank you. Now moving on, item 10.2, and I'll invite Mr. Muldoon to come back to speak to his recommendation in 10.2, which is Arts Northwest report for services in the Gunnedah Shire 2019 to 20. Mr. Muldoon, you could please turn your video on and speak to the recommendation.
Yep, okay. No disturbance, that's okay. Right, well, the report's presented to council purely to give some information on some of the services that Arts Northwest provides. We're a member of Arts Northwest, which is a small contribution in comparison to the advantages that we get for all the various activities that we get incorporated in through that organisation. So that said, I put the recommendation for council's consideration for information.
Thank you, Mr. Muldoon. Calling for a mover. Thank you, Councillor Fuller. Moved the motion and seconded by. Thank you, Councillor Moses. Councillor Fuller, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover?
No, Mr. Mayor, I think it's all self-explanatory. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now call for any elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hasler, you are on mute. Would you like to speak?
I would like to move an amendment to the motion.
Can we hear the amendment, please?
The amendment being an addition being that, and the Gunnedah Shire Council staff involved in presenting this comprehensive cultural program be congratulated for providing these welcome experiences for Gunnedah residents.
Ms. Markey, can I ask that you share your screen, please, so we can, all the elected members can see the wording of the amendment before us? Councillor Hasler, could you please continue on with that amendment, the wording of that amendment?
Yes, I changed the word inventing to presenting in this comprehensive program. Be congratulated for providing these welcome experiences for Gunnedah residents.
Okay, Councillor Hasler, can you please confirm that the wording on the screen is your intent?
That's correct.
I'll now call for a seconder to the amendment. Thank you, Councillor Luke. And Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak to the amendment?
Yes, just to the fact that I think the present situation that we're experiencing reinforces the fact that how important it was to have gatherings, in particular social art and cultural gatherings, such as the ones presented by the Northwest group and Arts Northwest and our staff who are working in this area. I think oftentimes it's underestimated how valuable it is and just how much we are experiencing in Gunnedah, because we have very active staff working in this area, and as well as community organisations. So when they complement each other, and I think it's at times like this is most appropriate to congratulate our staff.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the amendment or ask a question. Councillor Luke, is there a seconder to the amendment? Do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the reason why I'm quite happy to second this amendment is that from somebody that grew up in the city and spent many years in Sydney, it's amazing how much in Gunnedah that we have access to and be able to experience arts events, cultural events, and it certainly, I think, does come down to the proactivity of staff members and community members. It truly is wonderful what we have on offer here in Gunnedah.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll ask one more time, any elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the amendment before I put the amendment? Councillors, by show of hand, those in favour of the amendment? I call that unanimous. It now becomes the motion. I'll now put that as the motion. All in favour by show of hands? I'll call that unanimously supported and carried. Thank you. Now move on to item 10.3, which is the Civic Theatre seating budget allocation increase. And I'll hand back to Mr. Muldoon to detail the recommendations before us.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. This report's a bit bittersweet. The budget that was prepared for the civic seating was done several years ago, and it's been somewhat outdated when we've come to go to a quotation. Whilst that's a negative, a positive is the construction or refurbishment of the candy bar upgrade is progressing really well, and it will result in some significant savings on what was predicted. So to get the seating replaced, all the quotes that we received were well above the budget item. So we have an opportunity to transfer $15,000 from the capital project for the candy bar to the civic seating project, which would then enable us to progress with the quotations we've received. And at a time when the civic is unoccupied and not utilised, it's probably a preferable time to pull those seats out and put the new ones in. So with that said, I put the recommendation for council's consideration.
Here is that council reallocates $15,000 from the candy bar upgrade capital works budget to the civic theatre seat replacement project. I'll now, councillors, call for a mover of that motion and seconder. Councillor Hasler moved and seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak to the motion? Councillor Hasler, you're still on mute as well.
Sorry. Mr. Chairman, as a former chairman of that committee when we built that cinema, it's very pleasing to see that it has had that much use that the seats have been worn out and that we now are replacing them. Just a question though to Mr. Muldoon, just to clarify, is it the intention to have more seats than originally? And these seats, do we anticipate they will last longer than the last lot, although they did serve us for 2 decades or nearly 2 decades?
Thanks for your question, Councillor Hasler. The seats that we will replace them with, I don't anticipate will last longer. It obviously depends on patronage of the theatre, I think they're at a stage where we can't leave them for a lot longer. You know, if this resolution got down, we could maybe squeeze another 6 months or 12 months out of them. However, the risk is the nature of some of the seats, in particular the structure to the floor, adds a safety risk to it as well. I'm not sure whether I've answered the second question there. What's the second question you had, sorry?
The second question related to the number of seats. Are we replacing the same number or increased number? It's my recollection that it's going to be more seats, but I just wanted that confirmed one way or the other.
Yeah, sorry. Look, I'm not sure of the number of seats. Sorry, I'll have to take that on notice. My understanding is that it's the same, but I'll clarify that for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hasler. So I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Luke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There was talk at some stage, I think, when we had to replace the carpet as well, and it was easier to do that, I thought, at the same time as replacing the seats. Is that the case? Has the carpet been replaced, or is that going to happen concurrently?
Mr. Muldoon, are you able to answer that question?
Yeah, look, to my knowledge, there's no intention for the carpet to be replaced at this point. I'll certainly look at that as an option. It's probably the preferable time if we are going to, but I'm not aware of any replacement of that. So I'll take it on notice and have some discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Muldoon. I'll now call on Councillor Hook as the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak to the motion?
Only briefly, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I totally concur with what Councillor Hasler has to say. It's a very opportune time to be able to replace this seating for two reasons. One, because they are worn out and they're becoming a safety issue. And the second point is that it's not going to interrupt any activity during this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I'll now call for any further questions or comments from elected members. There being none, I'll now put that motion by show of hands. All in favour? Call that unanimously supported and then therefore carried. Moving on to item 10.4, which is outstanding resolution register. I'll call on Mr. Muldoon just to detail that recommendation that's before you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. The register is attached to the business paper. It's been updated since the last meeting. There's a bit of a push going through the next few months to try and reduce that register. Put it forward for Council's consideration of the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Muldoon. I'll now call for a mover of the recommendation become a motion.
I'll move it that way, so I've got some questions.
And a seconder, please. Thank you, Councillor Luke. Councillor Hasler. You may
I have 4 questions, Mr. Chairman. The first relates to the Simpson Bridge matter, which was commenced in 2017 and still not completed. That seems to be a very long period to achieve a result.
Councillor Hasler, can I ask you to please refer to the item number?
The item is, yes, Mr. Chairman, the item is 25.09-17 on page 26.
So I guess at this point I'd refer that question to Mr. Bartlett. Are you in the position to be able to answer that question?
Thank you, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I need to take that one on notice. I'm not fully across the detail of that particular matter, but I'll take it on notice and get back to you.
My second question, Mr. Chairman, relates to page 28, and it's item 2.12/18, and it's about affordable housing. And my question there is, when was affordable that housing legislation changed, and when is it likely to be available to? When is it likely that we have availability of staff, I presume, to undertake this work? I thought that the COVID supply issues at the moment might allow some staff to be working on these matters.
I'll call on Mr. Johns, Director of Planning, if you're in the position to be able to answer that question.
Mr. Mayor, and through you to Councillor Hasler. The legislation has been amended, as it indicates at the end of that comment there. I do have a staff member that has been working on that over the last few months, and I hope to be in a position to bring something to the next council meeting. I have written to a couple of providers of affordable housing just to have an exploratory discussion with those groups. That was probably maybe 4 weeks ago. I haven't heard back from them, so I can follow up on that one, but hope to have something back to council next month.
Thank you. I think there's a fair bit of demand of that sort of housing at the moment. If we could make some inroads, it'd be useful. But the next question related to item page 30, item 8.11/19, Gunnedah Airport report expected in the second quarter of 2020. This being in the second quarter, are we still on track to receive that report? Because I noticed another item later in the business paper relating to this same airport.
I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett, Director of Infrastructure, if you're in the position to answer the question.
Thanks, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. At this stage, we're expecting to need the information that's requested in the later report of this council meeting in order to guide that further report that you're referring to.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. And the last question relates to 3 actions on page 31, sorry, 19.02/20, 24.02/20 and 36.02/20. The comments there is that none of those have been started, even though they were carried 2 months ago by council. When do we expect some movement on those 3 matters?
I might refer to General Manager, Mr. Groth. You're in a position to give some advice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the question, Councillor Hasler. I'd suggest that probably the best thing to do is take each one and just get a comment from the relevant officer. Just whilst I am speaking, just in respect of the first item that was taken on notice, 25.0917, with respect to Simpsons Bridge, it's worth noting that much of that resolution hangs on approval from the Minister. There have been a number of matters that have been sitting on the Minister's desk, the prior local government Minister's desk. My understanding is that is one that's still a legacy issue from those items. So we're actually awaiting that. We've had a couple gazetted most recently with Wean Road and also with respect to the acquisition of the sale yards and STP land. However, my understanding is we're still waiting on Simpsons Bridge. However, Mr. Bartlett's taken that on notice and we'll get a more comprehensive response back to councillors.
Thank you. So just to clarify, Councillor Hasler, that was item dated 19th of the 2nd, 20. Yeah, your speaker, please, Councillor Hasler.
Sorry, yes, that was the first of the 3 on the same page.
19, and what were the others, please?
24 and 36.
Thank you. So, Mr. Bartlett, if I could ask if you're in a position to answer first question on 19.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. In relation to 1902/20, the Gunnedah RSL sub-branch Memorial Garden, the resolution register is correct. That work has not yet started. The staff resourcing at this time is providing somewhat of a challenge. The engagement process also with the RSL sub-branch group, which is required in order to do that, is also very difficult at the moment, given the demographic that we've got in that space.
Understood, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Also, in relation to 24, which is a councillor update, are you able to speak to that, Mr. Bartlett?
I am, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The council's chief engineer has been in contact with the contractor in relation to getting them back to undertake that water tightness testing. I believe, and I will confirm this in the coming days for sure, that the contractor is expected to be back in Gunnedah within the month.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. And 36, in relation to tendering of insurance brokerage services.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I gave the wrong number. It should be 34. My apologies.
Notice of motion on Porcupine Reserve. Mr. Bartlett, back to you.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. At this stage, staff have had an initial conversation with Rural Fire Service representatives, but that is the extent of what's occurred to date.
Right, I look forward to a future report.
Thank you. And now I'll call for an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion, starting with you, Councillor Campbell.
No, I have nothing to say. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Luke, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of questions in relation to the resolutions as well too, not as many as Councillor Hasler, but the first one is in relation to on page 28 of the business paper, 21.04/19, in relation to the hoarding. There does seem to be that there was a couple of court hearings in February, and I wondered what the outcome of those and what's the update on those hoarding matters. That's my first question.
Assume you're passing it to me, Mr. Mayor. Through you, Mr. Mayor, thanks, Councillor Luke, for the question. So there is a further directions hearing this Friday. We're hopeful that we receive some court orders in relation to 2 of the 3 properties this Friday to take action against that squalor and hoarding. The 3rd property, we believe that incident or that situation may need to result in a further hearing given the negotiations to date. But 2 out of 3 is positive at this stage, and hopefully the 3rd one will be sorted out in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. Councillor Luke, your second question.
Thank you for that, Mr. Johns. It is definitely a difficult issue. My second relates on page 30, 19.12/19, in relation to the contract or Stewart Surveys being engaged to do the desktop analysis. I wondered whether we had any progress on that front.
Assuming that one's being passed to me too, Mr. Mayor. Through you, Mr. Mayor, essentially I can report that we're expecting that draft report to be with us by the end of this month, and we've had discussions already with the Department of Planning and plan to give it to them by the end of this month so that they can provide some comment on that before moving to the next step.
Thank you.
So, Councillor Luke, as the seconder to the motion, you've just asked questions, so I'll take that as you've spoken to the motion. I'll now call for any elected member if you had any further questions or comments before I put the motion. There are no further questions or comments to councillors. I'll put the motion by show of hands. Those in favour? Call that unanimously supported and therefore carried. Mr. Muldoon, thank you for your contribution to our ordinary meeting for April. Moving right along to item 11 on our council meeting, which is the Director of Planning and Environmental Services reports. And I'll call on Mr. Johns, the Director of the Department, to join us by video and speak to our first item, which is 11.1, section 356, small grants, community and sports. It's the panel of council representatives. And I will call for nominations, councillors, as soon as Mr. Johns has completed speaking to his recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Johns.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you. I think you may have stolen my thunder there. This report very simply is seeking 3 councillors to form the assessment panel for the 356 small grants that will occur very early in the next financial year.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. So, councillors, I'll now, by show of hand, call for nominations. So if you'd like to nominate somebody, please put your hand up. Councillor Fuller, would you like to put your microphone on and nominate?
I'll nominate Councillor Hasler.
Councillor Hasler, by show of hand, do you accept the nomination?
Well, I was going to nominate a couple of others, Mr. Chairman, but I guess I'll stand.
Thank you. I'll now call for any further nominations. Councillor Hasler?
Councillor Luke and Councillor Fuller were the 2 I was going to nominate.
Councillor Fuller, do you accept the nomination?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Luke, do you accept the nomination?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, but I'm certainly happy. They're relatively time-consuming meetings, which sometimes impacts on my work. So if there's anybody else that is nominated, I'm quite comfortable for them to take my place.
The councillors, we have 3 nominations. I'll now call for any further nominations for the 3 positions. There are no further nominations. Congratulations, Councillor Hasler, Fuller and Luke, in taking those positions. So I'll now call for a mover of the motion that be accepted. And I'd prefer that not to be one of those nominated. Thank you, Councillor Moses, and seconded by? Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor Moses, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll now call for any elected member who'd like to speak against the motion. Councillor O'Keefe, would you like to speak as a seconder as the motion? Your speaker, please, Councillor O'Keefe.
My temporary unmute has stopped working. Just congratulate those who have accepted nomination.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. So, councillors, I'd now like to put that motion by show of hands. All in favour? I call that unanimously supported and therefore carried. So we'll move to item 11.2 now, which is development application 2020-001.002. And I'll call on Mr. Johns to detail the recommendations before you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you. This DA relates to a very minor amendment to an existing approval that this council's granted. Essentially, it is the relocation of a new water tank that is proposed to be built at the showground. Upon commencement of works, it became apparent that the water tank was encroaching onto one of the sporting fields. So this DA's, or this modification to this consent, is simply seeking council's endorsement of that being relocated closer towards the boundary and further away from the sporting field.
Thank you. And moved by Councillor Luke, seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Luke, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Seems quite self-explanatory.
I'll now call for a councillor who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
Only just to ask a question of the officer. How far did it have to be moved?
Off the top of my head, Councillor Hook, it was roughly 6.5 metres. So there was some very initial earthworks completed. So as far as I'm aware, the Show Society haven't been disadvantaged significantly as a result.
Thank you.
Councillors, no further questions or comments. I'll now put that motion by show of hands. All in favour? Unanimously supported, therefore carried. Moving on, item 11.3, which is community resilience, COVID-19 business support package is the item, councillors, and I'll hand back to Mr. Johns to detail the recommendation before you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you. So I guess essentially it's obvious that COVID-19 has had a significant impact not only on our Shire but also the world. So in response to this, council staff have developed a draft community resilience COVID-19 business support strategy, which is outlined and provided for council's information. The draft package has been prepared with some consultation with the Gunnedah Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We essentially looked at what we could do, what we could recommend that the council do in order to support the business community, in particular at this stage through this time. And I guess what we've aimed to do is try not to impinge upon what the state and federal governments are doing. And obviously for us to do what we can within our own sphere of influence to try and perhaps plug some of the gaps that may have been left by the state and feds and what they've been doing. So the package, as you would have read, is proposed to be in 2 stages. The first one being this support package or support package that is before you today, and the second is a recovery package. Now that recovery package will be worked on in the coming weeks and months. The support package, as you would have read, contains 7 key outcomes with 32 specific actions. And obviously developing a package like this is difficult. I guess the sands are constantly shifting as we speak. Even this morning, the state government has announced an additional $50 million to support the local business, to support statewide business in relation to relief in relation to licensing. So that's obviously, again, another thing that we need to be aware of when we're preparing such a strategy. And I guess it's important not to try and tread where our bigger cousins are treading and not to duplicate what they're doing. So there's a fairly concise summary contained within the report, councillors, that outlines the financial implications of this strategy. Obviously, there's a $220,000 figure being put on the estimate for the write-off of fees and charges and also interest foregone. There's proposal to utilise existing reserves for the business partner program up to around $80,000 and in excess of $1.25 million in relation to redeployment of expenditure and allocations in relation to staff. Councillors, I commend the report to you. Would welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. Councillors, I'm sure there'll be lots of content here that my fellow elected members would like to speak to here, but I'll call for the mover, and Councillor Luke is the first to put a hand up as the mover of the motion, and Councillor Hook is the seconder. So Councillor Luke, would you like to speak and start us off?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'd like to, I think it's great the work that's actually being done on this business package. I've just got a few comments and questions. It seems that throughout the tone of the document, it talks about at the end of the lockdown and that sort of language. Now, I believe that this is not just one lockdown and it's actually going to then start slowly getting back again. I think that we probably will have many lockdowns. So I'm worried about the language in some of this that actually talks about after the lockdown. And I will just a few extra issues there. When there's talk about the sewage access charges and what's the other one? And I think the other services for the businesses, how that's actually sort of going to be defined, the period, and what percentage of or how businesses will actually confirm that they are actually in need of that support, especially when there's actually businesses and business own and sometimes not owners, the property owners, to which many of the businesses don't own their own property and pay rent to landlords.
Councillors, as we go forward in an incident like that where we've got multiple questions, can we address them one at a time, just simply for ease of the actual director that we're asking the question of, to be able to address them one at a time, if that's okay. So councillors, we see that we have a mover and a seconder to the recommendation, which is in 3 parts. I know that you have that in front of you, and I know that you're all aware of that. So Councillor Luke, Mr. Johns, are you comfortable with those 3 questions? Would you like to hear them again one at a time, or are you okay to respond?
I think I've got them, Mr. Mayor, but Councillor Luke, please let me know if I miss anything. So you're exactly right. It is an ever-changing situation, and we've made some assumptions, that we're talking about the current lockdown, we're talking about the end of the financial year, but in reality, not knowing what's happening in the coming weeks and months does make it very difficult to sort of pin that down. So at this stage, we're proposing a plan that we believe will cover a lockdown of up to the end of the financial year. I would anticipate that if towards the end of this financial year we become aware that this lockdown may last for another 3 months or 6 months, we'll certainly be going back to the drawing board and preparing potentially a second phase for the business support strategy, for the business support package rather. In relation to your question, in relation to sewer access charges, there are a couple in there. One relates to liquid trade waste in relation to discharging into sewer. In that situation, it would be dependent on the business and whether or not they've paid that this financial, whether they're reimbursed or whether they, in theory, would have that waived. And I would imagine that in relation to the access to sewer, so any property that has a sewer main running out the front is levied or is rated to be provided access to that. I would imagine that situation, each business, each and every business that's non-residential non-residential would actually be reimbursed that amount for the quarter. So from the time of this strategy up until the end of the financial year, which equates to around a quarter. Does that answer your question? Sorry, Councillor Luke.
It does, thank you. And can I just further clarify whether there'll be an application process and a proof of downturn, or what's actually sort of going to happen with respect to that, with the application by businesses for that relief?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and to you, Councillor Luke, I guess in that situation, it depends on the measure or the action. Some of those relate to COVID impacted businesses, while others are simply a stimulus action that has been proposed by the support package. So it will depend. Obviously, a food shop or a hotel can very easily demonstrate an impact of their business, given that their doors are closed and that they're operating probably at 10 or 20% of their capacity. So it would depend on which action in particular you're referring to, but generally I don't think it's going to be difficult for most businesses to be able to demonstrate a downturn in their income.
Thank you.
I'll now call for an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Hasler.
A further question, Mr. Chairman, relating to the value of the package or how it's going to be funded. I note in the information we received on page 4, it talks about the fact that the Community Resilience Fund has 500,000 is uncommitted, but there's no mention of that specifically, as I see it, in the council's recommendation here. So we're not at this stage, it would appear to me, to be committing that 500,000 to this program. That would be something we would be looking at down the track. Is that the way you see it, Mr. Johns, or how are you going to specifically target that fund? And my second part of the question is...
Just take one at a time, please, Councillor. Sure. Thank you, Mr. Johns.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to Councillor Hasler. That's correct. At this stage, we have alluded to the fact that there will be a recovery package on top of the support package. So the support package is obviously for the pain being experienced right now, but we understand that there's no easy way of getting out of this situation, and the recovery is going to be it's going to take a long time. So at this stage, we're mooting to councillors that there is that money in reserve, and that down the track we may have to look at utilising that, but at this stage it's not proposed to use any of that.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. And my second question or part relates to the other 2 million in the Resilience Fund, which are from the state and federal government. My understanding would be that they would have to be spent as per originally allocated by those 2 governments, and wouldn't be available for what we're proposing here. Probably that's a question directed to the General Manager, seeing Mr. Foreman's not here, who's been managing the program.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Hasler. Essentially, what you're saying is correct. We would have to look at the merits of each individual spend as to whether it would satisfy the state or federal requirements with regard to their spend. But essentially, what we've tried to do with that Community Resilience Fund of $3.2 million is allocate the state and federal monies first, leaving our money where council has a greater discretion over the how it could be spent. So the Farmer Army money, the 500,000 to which you refer to, that's not committed, that is out of council's $1 million. So it would be it would be the preferred choice for repurposing, I guess.
Councillor Hook is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I do. It's become very, very evident that it's been extremely difficult for staff to produce a meaningful document with the nature of the beast that we're dealing with, not knowing the end result, not knowing exactly what the consequences of that result is going to be. Having said that, I think it's pertinent to congratulate the staff on the work that they've done. I think they've been extremely innovative, and I think that they've done it very sympathetically with the budget and working in conjunction with state and federal governments not to double up and double dip. So I'd like to congratulate the staff through you, Mr. Johns, and also to your team. I know they've put in a huge amount of work, and we've ended up with an extremely meaningful document, which is going to have some significant benefit to our community. So I commend the document.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a further question. Councillor Luke, you've spoken once. I'll just give the other councillors an opportunity first. Councillor Luke, you have a right to reply as the mover of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was just wondering, and perhaps this is a general manager type of question. We have been directed in the past that whenever there's a spending that we must allocate the budgetary pathway or out of which fund the spend comes from. Is there enough in this recommendation that actually fulfills those requirements?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Luke. Yes, I believe so. The recommendation is worded such that it refers to the detail in the report for the adjustment to the revenue items contained in that report up to the amount of $220,000.
Thank you.
Councillors, before I put the motion, I'd just briefly like to also support those comments by the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Hook. I'd like to congratulate the officer in charge and Mr. Johns, but also his entire team in coming up with this response. As we all know, our community is really, our entire community is really working out how we deal with COVID-19, the coronavirus, the effect in our community. Unfortunately, so many have had to close. Others have had to put people off. There are some businesses that are still quite busy and some that are even doing better than normal. But in general, across our community, we see doors are closed. We see that people have lost their employment. So I think it's appropriate. This particular package before us is very measured. As we've heard from the director, nobody knows when this is going to stop or how bad the effect's going to be. So it's a measured first response. I see 6 key areas within that I'm very happy to support. One, which we also voted on at the last council meeting, which is freezing the interest and accrual rates on rates and fees and charges on applications. The additional round of a business partner program, I think that's important and a good opportunity for us to target certain markets, as Mr. Johns spoke about, between the state and federal governments, looking for those black holes where we have some businesses that have not been able to get some support. That will be great. Reduction in the number of business fees. We've got promote and support local employment and local purchasing. So that's an important one for us in local government here too, to make sure we're having a really good look at where our spend is and at where all possible trying to make sure we're supporting those local businesses. Continue to waive street trading and footpath occupation fees and make it easier for those businesses that are open in our main street to show their wares, and where possible, council to use all local contractors and suppliers. They're key things. A measured approach. The value that we've heard is something like $1.6 million. On top of the $3.2 million as a response from this organisation in partnership with state and federal governments with a community resilience, which was our call to action as a council for the drought over the last 3 years now, adding this 1.6 on, councillors, as a first step approach to dealing and supporting our community and our businesses with the COVID-19. I congratulate the organisation. I certainly will be supporting. I hope my fellow councillors will support it, understanding this is the beginning. We don't know where it'll end, but it's a measured approach. So, Mr. Johns, thank you. And Mr. Groth, the entire executive team, thank you as well. In saying that now, councillors, I'd like to put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? I'll call that unanimously supported, and I'll call that then no doubt carried. Mr. Johns, thank you for your contribution to our ordinary meeting, council meeting for April. We'll now move forward on to item 12, which is the Director of Infrastructure Services reports. And I'll call on Mr. Bartlett, if he could start by detailing his recommendation in item 12.1, which is Clifton Road upgrade. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to inform Council of a successful application made under the New South Wales Government's Fixing Country Roads program to upgrade and seal Clifton Road. It seeks endorsement to allocate the required council co-contribution from the sources detailed in the report and to delegate authority to the General Manager to execute the funding deed. I commend the report to Council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll now call for a move of the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hasler, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover? You're on mute, Councillor Hasler.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions before I speak to it. Mr. Bartlett, on page 48, I think, 58, page 59, you talk about the VPA only, there was a reduction in the VPA for the cotton gin. That VPA was only related to road maintenance, was it? It seems a bit unfortunate that there would be no ongoing VPA results for our community beyond that road maintenance. I guess if that's the only thing that was written into the VPA, that will be the case. So I've got that question, then a second question, so you might want to answer them.
Thanks, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Johns may be able to correct me if I have this wrong. My understanding is that the VPA, or the conditions in the VPA, relate to the impact on the road as it was as an unsealed road, recognising the additional maintenance requirements that would be placed on that road associated with it being unsealed and the traffic movements on there. So when you go from a sealed road to an unsealed road to a sealed road, your maintenance profile changes, and the maintenance expense associated with a sealed road is significantly lower, even though the capital and the renewal expense is higher once it gets to the end of its life.
Second question, Councillor Hasler.
The second, well, my comment there was I would have thought that some further contribution as a VPA might have been useful, but in terms of the second question, on the next page, Mr. Bartlett talks about on page 60 that given that in justifying the council contribution to regional road maintenance is going to be reduced, he states that Rangarai Road will either be under construction or sealed. That seems a very confident prediction at this stage. Do you have what basis do you have that confidence on in Mr. Bartlett? Have we received notification that that road works is going to proceed? I understood that it was going through a process by which at this stage there's no guarantee of when it will commence.
That's correct, Councillor Hasler, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have a better crystal ball than anybody else, and I don't have any more concrete information other than what has been provided in the election commitment that Rangarai Road will get sealed, and that road will be bundled up in the review of regional roads to be handed over to the state government from local governments as part of that process.
Thank you for that information, and we'll watch with interest how that unfolds. But in the meantime, obviously, this is an extremely good result for our community, and particularly those people who utilise Clifton Road on a regular basis. And I commend you for the work in achieving this outcome and your ability to find the funding necessary from our council, which was fairly ingenious, if I may use that term.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. I call for a councillor who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillors, just before I put this motion, I'd just like to add a few words. One, huge congratulations to Mr. Bartlett and his team for the successful application under Fixing Country Roads. I know this was about the fourth attempt in our time as an elected group of members since going back to September 2016. I don't know past that how many applications have been put in for funding. As Councillor Hasler alluded to, our contribution of $1.255 million on a almost $9.5 million project was great to see that the impact on us, on our budget, is so low, and that the state government certainly have stumped up that $8.5 million. Councillors, this also shows the strength of being part, in my view, of a joint organisation. This Clifton Road has become had become one of the high priorities in the road strategy for Namoi Unlimited, and I'm sure that it played a big part in our success. And as Mr. Barton would probably back me up in saying, in us writing our application, having that support from our regional organisation of council certainly went a long way. So this is another way and another particular success story for us as a council about being part of a joint organisation. So councillors, in saying that now, by show of hands, those that support the motion, I'll put the motion all in favour. And I'll call that unanimously supported as well. Thank you. Moving on to item 12.2, and I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek council approval to fund a comprehensive airport pavement investigation to inform long-term financial plans, asset management plans, maintenance programs, and asset revaluations for the Gunnedah Airport. This information is critical to ensuring that any long-term strategic decisions made in relation to the airport and its operations are appropriately informed.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll call for a move of the recommendation to become a motion. Thank you. Councillor Fuller moved the motion and seconded by Councillor Hasler. Councillor Fuller, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak? Your speaker, Councillor Fuller.
Only to say that several people have inquired about this, and I think it's vitally important that we do take good care of that airport. No, happy to go forward and move that motion. Thank you.
Councillor Fuller, I'll now call for our elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a further question. Councillor Hasler is the seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman, because I'd have to say that my support is predicated on my question I asked before of Mr. Bartlett, which related to the fact that we're supposed to be undertaking a study on how we can make the airport more self-reliant, if I can use that term, and less reliant on our community funding it. And that, and if this particular allocation or reallocation of funding from the Parks and Gardens operation expenses allows that work to be undertaken so that we do have the true picture of what condition the airport is in and what it would need to happen to it to go forward, because I think the present crisis has highlighted the difficulties of some of the smaller airlines to service the regional centres, and they've all sought significant extra funding from the government to sustain their operations even now. And if we were ever to countenance an airline coming in here, well and good. But I think a few of them are going to be under pressure at the moment and won't be happening overnight. So we have to determine a methodology by which we can get this airport funded in a better way than what it is at the moment. And I'm looking forward to that study when it is completed, because I would find it difficult to support any increased input from council to the operation of the airport without a clear indication that we're going to get further funding to assist in the ongoing operation.
Well, Councillor Hasler, we have a motion before us on a particular item. I hear you connecting that to another item of, that's on the resolution register. You'll have to take that into consideration as you vote. But councillors, we are voting and we are making our decision on the recommendation before us that has been moved and seconded. That reads that council endorse the reallocation of $30,000 from Parks and Gardens operational expenses to airport operation expenses to fund a comprehensive airport pavement inspection. So now, councillors, one more call. Any elected member would like to ask a question or speak against the motion before I put the motion? That be the case, I put the motion by show of hands. All in support? I'll call that unanimously supported. Thank you. Therefore carried. Moving right along to item 12.3, which is Malali Recreation Grounds. Councillors, we have a motion before us that reads that council decline Warrumbungle Shire's request for financial assistance to upgrade the Malali Recreation Ground. That's the recommendation before you. I'll now call on Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation. You're on mute, Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And through you, the purpose of this report is to inform Council of Warrumbungle Shire Council's request for financial assistance in upgrading facilities at the Malali Recreation Ground. While Malali Village is located within the Gunnedah Shire, the Malali Recreation Ground, being a few kilometres out of town, falls within the Warrumbungle Shire Council area and is therefore their asset to maintain. It's on that basis that it's the officer's recommendation that council decline the request.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation becomes a motion. And out of any
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy. Oh, did you get someone? I was about to move.
No, I haven't. Yes.
Well, I'd like to move something just slightly different from what's there. And it'll be along the lines that council declines the present request for financial assistance to upgrade the Malali Recreation Ground, but indicates a preparedness to have discussion with the Malali community to determine what development they would like to see for the grounds.
Ms. Markey, could you share your screen, please, so the elected members can see the wording as dictated by Councillor Hasler? Councillor Hasler, can you confirm the wording on the screen is your intent?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think that that's my intent.
I'll now call for a seconder to the, well, it's only a recommendation before us, so this would become the motion, councillors. Call for a seconder. Councillor Luke seconds the motion. Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have some sympathy with the request from Warrumbungles because what they are doing there is providing, or would be providing, a facility for basically a community which is residing in Gunnedah Shire. I don't believe there's any question that there's a large amount of the users are from Gunnedah Shire of that ground, and I have been out to various events at that ground and know how passionate people are about it and ongoing use of it. I take the point that it is outside our shire, although I would question the question of kilometres. I would suggest it would be lucky to be a kilometre outside our shire. It's just across the bridge over the Cox's Creek to the left. And so there is obviously, but we would have to find out whether in fact and who within the community have been seeking this development. I'm not necessarily questioning Warrumbungle Shire Council's veracity, but they're asking us rather than our council, our residents of our community. And I would have thought that residents of the community would have been the first to come to us seeking support for Warrumbungles in developing that, rather than having Warrumbungles approach us as the initial any initial discussion. So I support the officer's recommendation at this stage, but I think that it is worthwhile having a discussion with that community to see what we may be able to do in supporting them, and certainly pointing them in the direction of appropriate grant funding, which quite a few community groups have been receiving in recent times.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask some question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I fail to see that Councillor Hasler's motion is actually going to go very, very far. It's been indicated now that through representation from the Mullally community, they talked to the Warrumbungle Shire Council, and that they determined that they would like an upgrade of the facilities at their sports ground. And we do know that those facilities would be of great benefit to the community. I further think that it is probably up to us to support in part the request from the Warrumbungle Shire Council, because while the facilities may be just outside our shire boundary, it certainly will, as Councillor Hasler pointed out, be of great benefit primarily to the residents within our shire. So it's not often that we get the opportunity to be able to support one of our major villages, and I think this is a great opportunity to do so. And in doing so, I would move another motion, an amendment to the motion, which says that Council provide a 20% co-contribution from general funds, being $50,000 to the Mullally Recreation Ground Upgrade Project.
Ms Markey, could you please share your screen so our elected members can see the wording? Councillor Hook, could you please confirm the wording on the screen is your intent for your amendment to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, that is correct.
I'll now call for a seconder to the amendment. Ms Markey, could I please ask you to remove your screen? I'll now call for a seconder to the amendment. Councillor,
yeah, sorry, I forgot the hand bit.
Councillor Fuller has seconded the motion. There'll be an opportunity to speak to it. Councillor Hook, you've spoke at some length. Did you want to add anything as the mover of the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I do. I think that the little that I do know of the proceedings with Warrumbungle at this stage, that they are seeking funding for this particular project. And to be able to give a co-contribution would give some certainty and some basis for Warrumbungle Shire Council to be able to say to either state or federal body where they're seeking funds from, that they do have a co-contribution already from Gunnedah, and I would assume that they would also put in a co-contribution themselves. And if you take the figure that they are potentially applying for, that would give a total co-contribution of 40%. And that, in my mind, would nearly assure that funding would become available and the project would get up and running. And I think we're not here to sort of more surveys and seeing what people want. We've heard what people want, and this is an opportunity to move the project forward. And I recommend the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the amendment. Councillor Luke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wondering if that we don't really know the process that Warrumbungle Shire went through determining that this was needed. And I think if we follow through with the quest finding, such as in Councillor Hasler's original motion, that would be the first step to take, rather than going into committing funds when we haven't heard anything, any research about the need, the costings, and all the other things that are necessary when such a capital expenditure is made.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. In reading the background in the notes as the report that comes to us from Mr. Bartlett, there is some detail there, I think, that may answer some of your questions. But Councillor Fuller, as a seconder to the amendment, do you wish to speak?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Look, I supported that for the conversation that we needed to have on it. I'm happy to go along with the support on it, but I think we need further information on it. Great initiative by Councillor Hook, but I think we need to get further information. Now that he's spoken on it, I'm happy to go with Councillor Hasler's resolution. Thank you.
So you seconded the amendment, but now you're not supporting the amendment?
No, I seconded as a debate on that conversation that was being had to support Councillor Hook as he spoke to as his choice to speak. So I've seconded it on that condition that we hear what he had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now call for any further questions. Or Councillor O'Keefe, would you like to speak?
I'd love to speak, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Markey, is there any chance you could share your screen again while I talk? I guess I'm going to try and play my usual trick, and procedurally I might see if I can have a go at wordsmithing Councillor Hook's proposed amendment, and if he and Councillor Fuller are happy to support where I get to.
Councillor O'Keefe, are you suggesting you're foreshadowing an amendment, or are you requesting that Councillor Hook and Fuller consider some changed wording on their amendment?
Mr. Mayor, I was going with option 2. I'm happy to foreshadow a further amendment if the current amendment is defeated, if you'd rather me go that way.
It's entirely up to you, Councillor O'Keefe.
Rather than defeat an amendment, I was going to have a go at wordsmithing it and see if I can make everyone happy. How about we do that?
Councillor Hook, we have Councillor O'Keefe wishing to suggest some changed wording to the amendment. My suggestion is it's a foreshadowed amendment. I'll take your advice on what you'd like to hear.
I would like to hear the amendment, be intrigued to see if we can stitch something together which everybody approves of.
Look, I'm going to overrule that, and you either asking a question, speaking against a motion, or you're foreshadowing another amendment, Councillor O'Keefe.
No dramas at all, Mr. Mayor. I'll foreshadow another amendment. Let's vote on this one, and I'll roll the dice if it gets knocked down.
Thank you. Ms. Markey, could you share your screen as Councillor O'Keefe shares some words with us with a foreshadowed amendment?
Righto, let's go. Where are we? Sorry, got my screen working again now. The council indicate support. Sorry, Donna, please change support for intention to provide a co-contribution from general funds being the lesser of $50,000 or 20% of the total project costs of the, yep, Mullally. And then at the end of that new sentence, yes, this co-contribution is contingent on the project being approved and funded.
Okay.
Zoom just attempted to sign me out. I think I'm back now. I'm just debating whether my last sentence is more correct. This co-contribution is contingent on project proceeding, I guess.
So, Councillor O'Keefe, are you content with the wording you see on the foreshadowed amendment on the screen?
I am. Very briefly to indicate the intention, I think we all want to explore helping Warrumbungles help, Mullally, which is essentially our community, understanding the issues of what side of Cox's Creek the recreation grounds is on. However,
sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, before you speak to the foreshadowed amendment, I'd like a seconder. I'll call for a seconder to the foreshadowed amendment. There are no seconders. I'll call one last time before it lapses. There are no, so I call that a foreshadowed amendment.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, with a foreshadowed amendment, it essentially just becomes a matter that sits on the table unless the amendment's lost. If the amendment's carried, it becomes a motion and council votes on that. If the amendment's lost, then the foreshadowed amendment becomes an amendment.
That being the case, councillors, we've come back to the amendment. We had a speaker who moved the amendment. We have a speaker who's asked a question. We had a speaker who spoke against, and Councillor Flores, a seconder to the amendment, spoke. So, councillors, before I put the amendment, are there any further questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'd have my right of reply. Thank you. Mr. Chairman and fellow councillors, look, I have some sympathy with the objective of Councillor Hook's amendment, but I think it's premature. We have had no discussions with the Mullally community. We're making supposition. Presumably they have been gone to the Warrumbungles Council. Who has gone, what was the outcome of it, etc., all unknown. And I believe we need to find out what has transpired to this point, what has been proposed, apart from what the Warrumbungles Shire has put to us, and have a conversation with the residents and potential users. I mean, we usually have, and quite rightly, have a responsibility to have consultation with the community before we spend monies and on projects, particularly ones that haven't been included in our forward plan. And here we are making decisions, or potentially making decisions, to spend not an insignificant amount of money on a project which we haven't heard about before. So let's get the process right, rather than doing applying for our hearts and thinking, oh yeah, let's help the people out there. Let's find out exactly what has taken place to get to this point, what has been asked for, what is required, and who have been making the representations. And in talking about going to other levels of government, well, I think my understanding would be that we're talking about two different electorates here, even. Warrumbungles being in Barwon electorate, and and us in the Tamworth electorate, for example. So there's a fair bit of research to be done before we make any knee-jerk actions like has been suggested here. So I'd urge people to support the original motion, which is to say no at this stage, but have further conversations and then perhaps bring it forward later on when we're speaking from a position of knowledge rather than one based on emotion.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. So, councillors, we have, we'll deal with the amendment now. So we know what the amendment, just Ms. Markey, if I could just ask you to please share your screen again. So we'll just check the wording of the amendment before I put that motion. Councillors, we're dealing with the amendment that was moved by Councillor Hook and seconded by Councillor Fuller that reads that Council provide a 20% co-contribution from General Fund, being $50,000 to the Mullally Recreation Ground Upgrade Project. Thank you, Ms. Markey, for your screen. Please remove your screen. So, councillors, by show of hands, all in support of the amendment. So we have 2, all against. Councillor O'Keefe, are you voting? You're frozen.
No, I'm not voting, Mr. Mayor.
Right, thank you. So I declare that amendment is defeated. So
Mr. Chairman, you can't have a non-vote. You've either got to vote in favour or against by the...
I'll take the non-voters against. Still defeated, Councillor Hasler. So we'll now move on to the foreshadowed amendment. That's before you, Ms. Markey. Can I please ask you to share your screen again with the foreshadowed amendment? Councillors, we have a foreshadowed amendment from Councillor O'Keefe that reads, the Council indicates intention to provide a co-contribution from General Fund, being the lesser of $50,000 or 20% of the total project cost of the Mullally Recreation Ground Upgrade Project. And second part of that is this co-contribution is contingent on the project proceeding. Thank you, Ms. Markey. If you could please remove your screen. I'll now call for a seconder to the foreshadowed amendment.
Just hang on, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, I appreciate Councillor Hook's offering to second. I just wanted to add another word to my amendment before we, or another couple of words to my proposed amendment.
Please share your screen, Ms. Markey. Thank you, Councillor.
Ms. Markey, just after proceeding, you can, not full stop, after proceeding, this co-contribution is contingent on the project proceeding with appropriate involvement by Gunnedah Shire Council.
Please confirm, Councillor O'Keefe, before I call for a seconder, that that is your intent, the wording on the screen.
Look, I'm happy to confirm the wording, as I often do. I'm happy for the General Manager or the appropriate Director, Mr. Bartlett, to ask me what I'm trying to intend to achieve out of that, or tell me to do something slightly smarter.
I'll now call for a elected member who'd like to second the foreshadowed amendment. Thank you, Councillor Hook. And Councillor O'Keefe, I'll now ask if you'd like to speak to your amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I can see the obvious merits of Councillor Hasler and his in support for the original recommendation, and Councillor Hook's original amendment are intending to go. Mullally's, I'll use Councillor Hasler's language, the heart and the head. Okay, obviously Mullally's our community and we should look after it, and we should, offer to support that community. Warren Bungles, if built this without our support, would be doing a large favour for our community. Agree completely with Councillor Hasler that we should know what we're getting ourselves into, and we shouldn't throw money without due process. I'm attempting to achieve both goals. I don't think the project will attract the support or funding opportunities that it may be seeking without support and co-contribution, in this case probably from both shires. So indicating our intention to support and provide a co-contribution makes grant applications and seeking funding by the community group that is proposing this works in the Warrumbungle Shire, which again is a community group heavily linked to our shire and one of our villages. So it gives them a chance, gives them and the Warrumbungle Shire a chance to seek funding and have a reasonable chance of getting that up with our support. By us co-funding, it means that we would need to have involvement and be funding an appropriate project. I see all of Councillor Hasler's points about probity and due process, and this council, in my experience, has never funded something that we shouldn't be funding or doesn't follow consultation, tick all the boxes. If we're involved in funding a project, the fact that there's a council resolution saying, hey, we'd like to indicate our support and intention to co-fund this, we're not going to follow through with that if the project's not worthy of funding or it doesn't tick all the boxes.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against that amendment that's before you. Councillor Hooker is the seconder to the amendment. Do you wish to speak?
Mr. Mayor, I think that Councillor O'Keefe has said pretty much all of it, and I've got nothing more to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, we've heard a defeated amendment. This was a foreshadowed amendment. Councillor Hasler's had his right of reply.
Mr. Chairman, I have a right of reply on every amendment if there is, as there is in this case, a foreshadowed one which has become now an amendment.
And Councillor Hasler, I was about to offer you a second one, so it sounds like you do want that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, without repeating what I said earlier, I would just say that I, and I don't believe other councillors, should make a determination of a figure for a project without having any consultation of community or having any staff investigate the project and provide feedback. Now, what I'm saying is not that much different from what Councillor O'Keefe would like to achieve, but also at the end of the process I'm suggesting, we might determine that 20% or 50,000 is not as much as we should. We might believe that we should co-contribute to 50%. But at this stage, I can't commit our council to an expenditure based upon no consultation, no prior planning from our staff's point of view, and no inclusion in our forward operation budget. I could, if we go through the process which we're talking about and which would be required if this motion is carried.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. So, councillors, we've seen the amendments. We've all had the opportunity of our Councillor O'Keefe's amendment. So I'm now going to ask the debate on that. All in favour of the amendment? Against? Declare that amendment defeated, 5 votes to 3. So we'll now go back to the original motion, councillors, which is that council decline Warrumbungle Shire's request for financial assistance to upgrade the Mullally Recreation Ground. I'll now put that motion. All in favour?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, could you read that motion out again, please?
The motion that was passed by Councillor Ms. Markey, can you please share your screen just so I can confirm that the motion is as I have on my screen? Sorry. Okay, I'll just clarify that. So the motion that we have before us is that council declines the present request of financial assistance to upgrade the Mullally recreational ground. However, it indicates a preparedness to have discussions with the Mullally community to determine what development they would like to see for the grounds. Okay, councillors, thank you, Ms. Markey. That is the motion that we are now voting on. So by show of hands, all in favour of the motion? Against? I'll declare that motion carried. Thank you. Moving right along, item 12.4, which is Gunnedah Town Hall Structural Engineers Report. And I'd now like to hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation of council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek approval to fund a comprehensive structural engineers report for the Gunnedah Town Hall for the reasons outlined in the report. I commend the report to council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation to become a motion. Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and seconded by
I'm happy to second that.
Councillor Fuller. Thank you. I saw your hand first. Councillor Campbell, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover of the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just reading from the report from the director that this needs to be done and it needs to be done urgently.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Fuller, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, Mr. Mayor, I'm totally in support of this. I think it's one of the most important buildings in our community, and we need to get it right. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller. Any further questions or comments, councillors, before I put the motion? That be the case, we'll put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? Declare that unanimously supported. Thank you. Moving on, item 12.5, which is Water Services 2019-20 operational plan changes. And I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek council's approval to make changes to the Gunnedah Water Supply 2019-20 Water Main Replacement Capital Works Program. I won't go into a huge amount of detail. Most of that's all included in the report. However, the most notable improvement that these changes would result in is the completion of the water main connection linking the third pressure zone of Gunnedah Water Supply to the Wondabar rural residential area. And that will enable the decommissioning of the pump station and the removal of the private property flow restrictors.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I now call for thank you. Councillor Hasler has moved the motion and it's seconded by Councillor Fuller. Once again, Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak as the mover of the motion?
Just to reinforce what Mr. Bartlett said, that servicing of that Wondabar area has been a significant problem over a period of time, and to have rectification in this way is very positive. And I think it's also good to see the other works that we're doing in terms of replacement of out-of-date pipes that should be continued as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. I now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Fuller is the seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
I'm absolutely delighted to second it and support it. I think it'll be great for Gunnedah and those areas out there that have been waiting for such a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, I'll now put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? Call that unanimously supported and therefore carried. Item 12.6, water conservation. I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you, councillors.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to allow council to consider the lifting of level 1 water restrictions and reintroduce the permanent water conservation level. As councillors would be aware, level 1 water restrictions were introduced into all Gunnedah town water supplies from the 1st of January 2020. Given the recent changes in weather patterns being experienced since early February and a reduction in the water demand, it has become prudent to consider lifting these level 1 water restrictions and reintroducing the permanent level conservation measures.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Now call for a mover. Thank you, Councillor Luke, and seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Luke, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's nice to had all that rain. Should we come into times again, I hope that when if we do have to put back in place next summer or the further restrictions, by then hopefully we'll have actually had an upgraded or a rejigged drought management plan, and which is probably hopefully will have more appropriate conditions at the various levels than what we have had in place during these current restrictions over this last summer.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any further questions or comments, councillors? Just before I put the motion, councillors, I'd like to add a few points. I certainly will be supporting the recommendation or the motion now that it is before us. I understand why we moved into self-imposed level 1 restrictions well and truly before our drought management plan dictated that we need to do so. I think it was appropriate at the time. I'm very encouraged to see that hopefully shortly we'll be moving back to level P, which is permanent conservation. And this sends a very clear message out to the residents, to those doing business in our community, and those who are considering potentially doing businesses in our community in the future, that while we look around us in many different regions right throughout New South Wales, as we went through the worst drought in living memory, that we were on level 1 self-imposed water restrictions now coming off, that Gunnedah is a very sound opportunity if you want to do business or you want to have a secure water supply as a resident moving into Gunnedah. So I think it's great news. I'll certainly be supporting it, and I hope my fellow councillors also support moving from level 1 back to level P. And in saying that, councillors, I now, by show of hands, will ask you to vote on the motion. All in favour? I declare that unanimously supported. Thank you, and therefore carried. Moving on, item 12.7, which is waiving showground fees for the flu clinic. And I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek council approval for Northwest Medical to host a drive-through flu vaccination clinic at the Gunnedah Showground and to waive the associated fees. I commend the report to council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll now call for it. It's moved by Councillor Hook and it's seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Hook, as the move of the motion, you wish to speak to it.
I think it's a great initiative of Northwest Medical and well supported by council.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. Do I have an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion? Councillor Fuller is a seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak to the motion?
I congratulate council on being so proactive and supporting this. I think it's a great initiative by the doctors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller. And just before I put the motion, councillors, this pandemic has put a lot of pressure on our community. It's great to see the medical professionals in our community, as we're being advised by both state and government and federal governments, that those in risk and those in essential services should be getting the flu vaccination. The numbers should be increased on a normal year based on the pressure that the whole of Australia and the whole of the world are having with the coronavirus pandemic that's before us. So this is a small part that we can play as a council in waiving these fees and making it safer for our medical practitioners, but also making it a lot easier, I guess, for certain parts of our community to come out and to get the flu vaccinations. And it's my hope that more organisations in our community will also want to follow in doing something similar. So councillors, in saying that, I now will put the motion. So those support by show of hands in favour. I'll call that unanimously supported as well and therefore carried. Moving on to item 12.8, which is bridge inspection, transfer of funds, and I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek council endorsement to transfer the remaining budget from the developer servicing plan for stormwater to the capital works project to a level 3 timber bridge inspection and assessment of Orange Grove Road Bridge.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll now call for a count. Thank you. Councillor Hasler has moved the motion and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Hasler, do you wish to speak to the motion as moved?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say that for someone that travelled over that bridge for many, many years on a regular basis, I'm surprised that something else hasn't required more work than what may be suggested to date. So it'll be interesting to see what the findings are. I wholeheartedly support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. I'll now call for a councillor who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion.
Just like to ask a question, please, Mr. Mayor. Is this the bridge out just below Keeper Dam, the low-level bridge?
Thank you, for Councillor Campbell, for the question. And yes, that's correct. It is.
Councillor Moses is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll call for any further questions or comments or councillor who'd like to speak against the motion before I put the motion. That be the case, I put the motion by show of hands. All in favour? Call that unanimously supported and therefore carried. Moving on to item 12.9, Gunnedah Shire Ground location of new amenities block. And I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail that recommendation before you in two parts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to seek council endorsement of the proposed location of the new amenities building at the Gunnedah Showground. I commend the report to council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Now calling for a move of the recommendation. Thank you, Councillor Fuller, and seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Fuller, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
I now call for any elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook, as a seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know that Mr. Bartlett and his team have had many discussions with the user groups over this. There's 4 different proposals, and I think sensibility has won out in the end. So I recommend the proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. Councillors, by show of hands, I now put the motion. All in favour? I call that unanimously supported, therefore carried. Moving on to item 12.10, which is Gunnedah Local Traffic Authority Advisory Committee, and I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to advise council of 3 recommendations made by the Gunnedah Local Traffic Advisory Committee by way of electronic notification instead of the normal meeting practices which occur in person due to the current social distancing measures enforced by government as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. I commend the report to council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. So, councillors, you'll see the officer's recommendation in 3 parts before you, which talks about the outcomes from that committee meeting. So in saying that, councillors, I'll now ask for a mover of the recommendation to become a motion. Thank you, Councillor Luke, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Luke, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover of the motion?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Moses is a seconder to the motion, and I believe also our council representative on the local traffic committee. Do you wish to speak to this motion?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's self-explanatory.
Thank you, Councillor Moses. So, councillors, in saying that, there's been no questions or councillors speaking against the motion. I'll put the motion. All in favour by show of hands. Councillor Fuller, is your hand's up? So I'll call that unanimously supported, therefore carried. Moving on to item 12.11, which is Gunnedah Memorial Park Cemetery burial beam installation, and I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation before us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to ratify the General Manager's decision under delegation to reallocate funding to construct 2 concrete burial beams at Memorial Park Cemetery to cater for expansion of service requirements. I commend the report to council.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Calling for a mover. Thank you, Councillor Fuller, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Fuller, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
No, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller. Do I have an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to know, what is a burial beam?
Thank you, Councillor Hasler. Councillor Hook. I believe there's certain information that goes into detail in the report, but for further clarification, I'll direct the question to Mr. Bartlett, the manager or the executive officer of infrastructure, to give us a bit more enlightenment.
Thank you, Councillor Hook, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. The burial beam is essentially where the memorial plaques end up being placed. So it essentially is a concrete slab adjacent to which or perpendicular to which, I should say, the burials occur.
So I take it.
Thank you.
Take it, Mr. Bartlett, that's where the headstones lie?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hasler is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
Well, I'm happy to support the motion, but I just want to take the opportunity to ask. I do understand that there was obviously a lot less mowing and that to be done in the last summer, etc. But we've had a number of items in this in this council meeting referring to savings made in the operation of parks and gardens. Have we been running with less staff than what we would normally run, or what have been the major savings, if I can use that term?
Thank you, Councillor Hasler, for the question, and through you, Mr Mayor. The primary savings have been as a result of 2 positions that have been vacant and also a reduction in the mowing that's been occurring.
Just to follow up, Mr Chairman, the positions, are they being filled, going to be filled, or have been filled? Because I imagine there's a fair bit of work to be undertaken now that we've had good rain, etc.
Absolutely, Councillor Hasler, that's correct. And through you, Mr Mayor, we have had very good rain, and we have had in more recent months a significant need to be doing mowing. Those positions are now currently full, yes.
We'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask the question. That be the case, I'll put the motion. All in favour by show of hands. Councillor Moses, you're supporting the motion, right? I'll call that unanimous, therefore the motion is carried. Moving on. Sorry, that is the last item of business for Mr Barber, so thank you for your contribution to our ordinary meetings council. Moving on to item number 13, councillors, which is the Chief Financial Officer's report. And I'll call on Mr Connor, if he could please turn his video on and join us and detail the recommendations that he has before you, councillors, which item 13.1, our investments.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you to the council. Councillors, the report before you is the monthly report on council's investments. We could probably speak at this for quite some period of time to detail the environment that we're working in at the moment. I'll try and keep it simple to say that obviously it's quite a challenging environment at the moment to get adequate returns in. The Reserve Bank obviously cut official cash rate to 0.25, the lowest it's ever been in history in the previous sitting. But similarly, at the same time, they're actively buying government bonds, which is trying to put a little bit of stability into the market, although it's fairly modest still, the returns that are there. So we're doing our best to manage our cash flow at the moment, which also has some work associated with that, knowing what's coming, making sure that we can provide payment to suppliers and the like as quickly as we possibly can, and then also trying to manage our liquidity and our returns. We aren't the Lone Ranger on this front at the moment, working in a pretty difficult environment. This week, Australia kept its AAA rating. However, modelling expects potentially a retraction up to 6% of our economy, which equates to about $130 billion. So we're expecting more headwinds to come in the next little while. Unemployment figures will be confirmed for March. In the coming days, it's expected that they will double from 5.1% to 10%. However, it's noted that this impacts far less than what it may have been without the current stimulus packages. So not a lot of bright side there, unfortunately, other than we're managing as best as possible. It's the environment that we're in at the moment, and I'd suggest that we'll be in for quite a period of time. Commend the report. Welcome any questions council may have.
Thank you, Mr Connor. I'll call for an elected member to move the recommendation. Becomes a motion. Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor Campbell, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Luke, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Just before I put this motion, councillors, I acknowledge, Mr Connor, the difficulty and the frustrations that you may have and your team. One very, very bright light in amongst all this is the fact that we are in a very stable financial position with investments of almost $60 million. And that's not just for commitment to you, but also to the whole organisation and specifically the leadership of the General Manager, Mr Groth, and the stewardship over many, many years of not just my fellow elected members now, but elected members that have gone before us. make sure we're in the fortunate position we are, especially with this COVID-19 virus, and of course the last 3 years of drought that our community have been suffering through. The enormous amount of workload that we've had on this organisation over the past 3.5 years of our council. We came in basically with the numbers at about the same, but yet the investment, the projects that have gone in, and we've still been able to keep that really quite stable. That amount of money that is invested is a testament to this organisation. Congratulations to all involved. Now, in saying that, councillors, by show of hands, all in favour? All that unanimously supported, therefore carried. Thank you, Mr. Connor, for your contribution to our ordinary meeting. Moving on to item number 14, councillors, and that is reports to committee. We have item 14.1, Audit Committee meeting report held on the 18th of March. Councillors, we have the details before you. In your business paper, so I now call for a mover of that be accepted. Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Campbell, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's pretty straightforward.
Thank you, and I will note, Councillor Campbell, you're our representative on the Audit Committee. Thank you for your contribution over the 3.5 years too. It's quite a challenge, I'm sure.
Not really.
I have an elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Fuller is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor.
In the case, I put the motion. All in favour? All that unanimously supported, therefore carried. Moving on, item 15, which is delegates reports. Councillors, we have 2 delegates reports. First, starting with item 15.1, which is the Association of Mining and Energy Related Councils meeting held on the 6th of March. And I'd like to ask, we have 2 delegates, that's Councillor Hasler and Councillor Hook, who attend those meetings. Our first delegate is Councillor Hasler, who's also, I believe, on the executive of this organisation. Therefore, I'd like to ask Councillor Hasler if he'd like to speak to the report that councillors have had before us in our business papers.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've tried to, along with Councillor Hook, provide a fairly detailed report, so I'll only just mention a couple of items. I draw your attention to the questions directed to Mike Young, who is, as many of you will already realise, the officer who is oversighting both the Chenoir and Vickery applications at this present time. He did report that one of his former colleagues, David Kitto, has departed the department. That was welcome news in some areas and probably not so welcome in others. Secondly, the VPA framework, an agreed process between the Minerals Council and Merck. Mr. Young has agreed to circulate that document and he also indicated that they would review the guidelines for VPAs for solar farm developments. In the past, we've been told that VPAs didn't apply to solar farms. We're now getting significant pressure for that to take place, and Merck had requested that as well as I think Mr. Barilaro might have been one as well. And I just point to the other thing, the Andrew Bray, the community fund set up in Moyne Council from wind farms, VPAs, is, I believe, going to be an excellent template for other councils to utilise. I suggest you look at the presentation that he gave us, which has been circulated to councillors if you haven't already done so, because I think it's a very good concept of that community fund being developed for use in the community from those wind farms. Just finishing on that one, I just point out that the meeting at Blaney has been cancelled, obviously because of COVID, although an executive meeting will go ahead using Zoom or some other methodology, obviously for the same reasons we're having this meeting today. So that executive meeting and other delegates will be able to listen in on that meeting, but obviously not be voting members.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll just ask Councillor Hook, would you like to add anything as a second delegate on that Working group. You're on mute, Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, I'd just like to congratulate Councillor Hasler and commend him, because he was the one that put probably 90% of that report together. I only sort of fiddled around the edges with it, but I would strongly recommend that Council do have a look at that report, and especially as it relates to the new innovations around VPAs and wind farms down in the southern part of Victoria. Great innovation going on there, and really I've spent a couple of years on that organisation to start with. I questioned whether we were getting value for money, but in recent times, I think you'll find that the organisation is really doing great work, and is certainly doing very, very good work for mining related councils. So I commend the executive. They do a lot of hard work down there. The rest of us come along for the ride and basically endorse what the executive comes up with. So I think they're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hooks. Councillor Hasler, I assume you're moving your report?
Yes, happy to do so, Mr. Chairman.
I'll now call for a seconder to the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hook. Councillor Hasler spoken. I'll just ask if there are any councillors who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motions before you. Councillor Hook, who's the seconder, has also spoken. So if that be the case, councillors, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Call that unanimously supported, therefore carried. Moving on to the next, which is 15.2, Local Government New South Wales Tourism Conference, held on the 16th to the 18th of March. I will just publicly thank Councillor Hasler for attending that in my absence at somewhat not a lot of notice, and I would like to invite Councillor Hasler now to speak to the report that councillors have before us in relating to the conference.
Well, once again, I've tried to give a reasonably comprehensive report, Mr. Chairman, so I'll just make probably 2 or 3 comments. Firstly, I believe these conferences are very valuable. They're aimed directly at local government tourism operations, and therefore I think are very relevant to both elected members and staff. So I'd encourage council to keep going to them in future years. I point to Hamish Fell, the consultant for the Albany tourist hub. I found his report very interesting. He reported on about 3 aspects, but one in particular was he was showing how technology was used to identify tourist numbers visiting the Visitor Information Centre or a hub, and that technology not only counted them, but was able to differentiate between adults and children. So they also were projecting images up to 4 minutes films on their walls and at night on the windows, so that you've got these images depicting the community and tourism activities in that community using this technology, which seems to me, and that reduces the amount of labour required. So very innovative, and also the use of touch screens for bookings of events and that, so people doing their own bookings online. Pirelli Bell, the chair of Australian Regional Tourism, talked about how some areas are naturally man-made tourist attractions. Other areas benefit from people passing through. And I think we've got to, there's the opportunity to take greater advantage of those passing through traffic in Gunnedah. But however, thank you very much for allowing me to attend as a delegate, and I hope the report is useful.
Thank you, Councillor Hasler, and I should be moving your report. I'll call for a seconder to the motion before you, councillors, which is that council receives and notes the delegates' report for the LG New South Wales Tourism Conference 2020. Thank you, Councillor Luke has seconded that motion. I'll now call for any elected member who'd like to ask a question and speak against that motion. Councillor Luke is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
I'd just like to compliment Councillor Hasler on the pretty pictures in his reports, and the reports themselves make very good reading. he does a good job of writing these reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, I'm now going to put the motion. All in favour? Unanimously supported, therefore carried. Thank you. Item 16 is notice of motion or question on notice. We have a question on notice, and that is from Councillor Hasler. It's item 16.1. I'll read that. It's before you, councillors, but before I ask Councillor Hasler to speak to this, or therefore the responsible officers for their response to the question on notice, I'll read that out. That given today, which was the 6th of April 2020, article entitled Councils Bleed Revenue as Cost of Virus Surges in the Sydney Morning Herald, in which it was stated the peak body for local government in New South Wales said councils face the real risk of having to cut essential services, infrastructure maintenance and staff. The cost of the revenue impacts are rapidly escalating. Local government New South Wales President Linda Scott said. The question basically is, could council senior staff provide council with a detailed assessment of how they anticipate the essential services, infrastructure maintenance, staff and financial security of Gunnedah Shire Council will be affected by the impacts of the policies implemented by federal and state governments in attempting to confront the COVID-19 virus? And I'll refer, well, we have the question from Councillor Hasler, so I'll refer to Mr. Groff to either answer the questions before us or refer us to the relevant officer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you, and thank you to Councillor Hasler for the question. It's a critical question that every one of the 128 councils in New South Wales, in fact, local government across Australia, would be grappling with at the moment. I preface any comments with the fact that I can only speak to our situation in any detail, and certainly not that of councils elsewhere. The other issue is that I wish I was in a position to provide a detailed assessment of what the future impacts would be, but the reality is, with the circumstances changing as rapidly as they are, it's nigh impossible to give a detailed assessment of what consequences of future events may be. However, saying that, I think it's important to note that all of our staff are still, 100% of our staff are still gainfully employed throughout the COVID crisis to date. Council has taken a fairly proactive position, I would suggest, in terms of a position statement. So there was two joint statements issued by the three unions, the USU, the Engineers Association and the Planners Association, with LG New South Wales as joint statements. Council can proudly say that it is certainly meeting the benchmark with those, and in fact exceeding some of those. A splinter award was made by the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission yesterday, 14th of April, and that splinter award provides a number of options. Council is one of 102 councils who have opted in to that splinter award, and that gives us a number of options should we need to essentially stand down staff or take some additional initiatives that weren't provided under the award. Again, I'd stress that our position statement as an organisation is a more advantageous position statement than what is provided for under the Splinter Award, and quite proud of that. In the event that staff have to be stand down, then what we are proposing is that we provide up to 4 weeks paid special leave, in addition to any unpaid special leave in certain circumstances. That includes issues where staff may need to care for someone, that, such as children that are returned home because of COVID impacts on schools or childcare. But it also includes the situations where someone may have come in contact with someone with COVID-19 and is forced to self-isolate. So those types of situations, we would extend paid special leave. In the business support package, which Council endorsed earlier this evening, there was approximately $1 million worth of costs there that estimates for that 4 weeks paid special leave. That's a cost that's already estimated within Council's current budgets and within the forward budget for 2020-21. So I guess this comes back to probably some of the differences between us and other councils. We're not in the situation that we're running childcare centres. So that's been a fairly daunting situation for those councils that are in that position. Up until the state government earlier last week announced that they would fund $80 million worth of coverage for those councils which are running childcare centres. So that was something that is rather fortunate for those councils. However, again, I'd stress that our staff are fully employed at the moment. We've also taken the position, contrary or in addition to the Splinter Award, that any casuals that we're currently employing, we will also grant paid special leave. And the reason that council, the executive management team is very comfortable in doing so is that we believe that we can appropriately redeploy those staff, either redeploy them to other duties within council or give them the option of working from home on alternate duties. It would only be where it was impossible to do so or a staff member unreasonably rejected a redeployment option where they would need to consider their paid special leave situation or potentially tap into their leave entitlements should they have such. So from a staff point of view, I'm quite proud of what we as a council can achieve and provide. At a macro level, in terms of the finances, at a very high level, and I'll ask Mr. Connor to add anything that he may like to in more detail from a financial perspective, which is, I guess, largely the thrust of Councillor Hasler's question in addition to impacts on services or projects. But from a macro level, I've estimated roughly it's around about 13% mark of our revenue in the 2021 year, which would be subject to, based on the current year's financial statements for 1920, would be subject to some significant impact by COVID. So that amounts to approximately just over $4 million. And much of that was significant items such as adjustments for landfill last year. We do expect, as Mr. Connor touched on earlier, to take a hit on our interest revenue, both our interest from investments, but also our interest on overdue amounts, given council's resolution in March to waive interest on those overdue amounts, particularly where someone enters into an arrangement with council. So there's no doubt we will suffer some hardship financially, but very solidly, our revenue is should be largely unfazed unless there's intervention from the state government in terms of what we're likely to raise as revenue. The bigger issue will potentially be cash flow issues, which I'll defer to Mr. Connor to make any further comment on that. With respect to the elements of Councillor Hasler's questions on impacts to services, commencing next week, councillors will receive a weekly update on any impacts to significant projects or major projects that council is currently undertaking. So Mr. Bartlett kicked that off with a memo to councillors, I believe it was last week. Forgive me, days are blurring at the moment. But that memo essentially foreshadowed what we'll kick off next week with a weekly update on all significant and major projects, that will essentially detail whether they've been impacted by the COVID crisis or if they have, what the nature of that impact is, whether it's dollars, time, scope of project, etc. And further, where those projects are grant funded, what the impact and what work has been undertaken to shore up those grants in the event of any milestone slipping. Again, we can't crystal ball it and say what will potentially happen in the future, but I can assure councillors I'm very proud of the work that the staff, our professional staff, have undertaken to date to shore up significant projects. There are services that have been impacted. All councillors would be aware of the majority of, if not all of those now, such as the pool and the Civic, which the library, those we've had to close as a result of public orders by the state government and social distancing rules. Playgrounds that have had to be banded up, for example, that cannot be used because we can't provide assurance of hygienic use of those facilities. So those those services are certainly impacted. But what I do give an undertaking to councillors and the public is that as services are impacted, we will provide the most expedient information we can and the most detailed information we can on those impacts. And certainly at this stage, there is no essential services that we expect to be impacted without a move to the red phase of our response strategy, which has been circulated. And hopefully we have no need to. I hark back to Councillor Luke's comments earlier on and certainly acknowledge that we are likely not to face one lockdown, but maybe iterative processes in terms of lockdowns. Council staff are mindful of that and certainly in a position to respond. We can't control the external environments, but I'm very comfortable that we're in a position to do all that we can in that regard. Having said that, unless there's any questions to what I've just said, I'd be pleased to ask Mr. Connor to provide any further comment that he may wish to.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, ever so briefly, I think the General Manager has covered all of that quite comprehensively. The only thing I'd add is that the major thing that's going to be a challenge for us moving forward is obviously our income. The initial response to this situation and the phase that we're in at the moment, we've spoken at length about the challenges to more so our expenditure and where we needed to spend in that, and the programs which we're running. A lot of the income impact will be longer running and will be more around our user fees and charges, particularly those that are more discretionary. Our rates and annual charges income, a lot of our operating income are largely fixed and consistent. So it'll be in those areas. It'll give council some confidence that they are largely modelled in the draft budget that went through tonight. So certainly a large write down of income from interest and investments is included in there. There's some modelling that's taken down estimates for user charges quite a bit for both water and sewer services. Planning and building regulation fees and licences have all been adjusted downward in those forward estimates as best that we can. So to that end, what would be somewhere between a 2.1 and 6.3% decrease in our overall revenue, our overall operating revenue, has largely been modelled into the results that you've seen today, with the exception, and one of the areas where we have got significant exposure is we do a lot of work for Transport for New South Wales with regard to contract works on their highways. Now, if that was to change markedly, that would have an effect on us. That's a considerable amount. And also it's largely a fixed cost because of the equipment and the people that we have that deliver those works. It's modelled in the next year based largely around some modest long-term estimates of work that we do for them. But there's a preface there that if the state government goes into a retractionary period where they move away from that, and there's nothing at this point in time to indicate that that will be the case, that will offer us some further challenge, and that figure's not immaterial. Other than that, on the expenditure side, in the recovery phase, other than the programs that council resolves to run and the strategies that we resolve eyes wide open to put in place, we're not expecting the challenges to be on that side. However, we may be required as an organisation to attempt to do the same with slightly less in order to dampen some of the income challenges that we do have. But the advantage we have is where we've started from, as opposed to the current situation. So being in a position to address these issues and being in a position where we can handle running some operating results that we wouldn't accept in the longer term, in the short term, and absorb some of the impact is the advantage that we have. And so certainly at this point in time, as the General Manager mentioned, we haven't had any conversations about cutting of services or maintenance on infrastructure and the like, and that certainly is not our intention from a financial viewpoint at this point in time. The future will have some challenges in it. I don't make light of that whatsoever, but I think we're reasonably well served to address those.
Thank you, Mr. Groff. Thank you, Mr. Connor, for quite a comprehensive response in relation to the question on notice. we do appreciate the effort, the time that you've put into preparing yourself for that. Councillors, now we'll be moving to the next portion of our council meeting, which is closed. So therefore, I call on an elected member to move that we move into a closed meeting to discuss those reports of a confidential nature. We have Councillor Hook move the motion, Councillor Moses seconded the motion, and I'm now going to put that motion. All in favour? Declare that unanimously carried. For those listening online to the April ordinary meeting of council, we'll now be suspending our broadcast as the elected members will be discussing matters of a confidential nature. We will be resuming the broadcast, and I will read out the reports, the resolutions that pass at closed meeting of council at the conclusion of the meeting. So for those who are interested, you'll be able to connect as soon as we finish our closed meeting of council, be able to connect back to this particular link and hear the resolutions being read out at the end of the meeting. So for now, we'll be suspending our live broadcast.
If you can please stay on the line and just wait for me to end the meeting, councillors. This is Alice Winepool here. Thank you. And then obviously go into the second closed meeting room. Sorry, I should have added. All right, I'm ending the meeting. Thank you.